Stellenbosch University agricultural economist Wandile Sihlobo joins us now for more. Wandile, a very good evening to you. Thank you for your time. After a few years of solid activity, it appears that South Africa's agricultural sector faces a rather daunting year ahead. What are some of the driving factors behind this element of pessimism?
I think the first thing really important to emphasize here is that while we see the index dropping to 40 points, but I think this period is also comparable to a distinct period, which is the first quarter of 2020, when we were in COVID period for the first time, and the lockdowns were a key issue that was being implemented. This is all to signify the difficulty of the moment that we are in when you're thinking about the sentiments in the sector. And I think some of them are long-running themes, structural issues in the logistics, animal diseases that are continuously being addressed but remain a threat, municipalities that are not functioning fairly well, and of course, the current drought becoming one of the more pressing issues. I think for me, these are some of the broad things. And even when we carry through these surveys and we listening to what the respondents are saying, they all speak about the network issues, which is the logistics, water, and the ports. And the other aspect that people always refer to, of course, is these issues of the animal diseases. But I do think that there are other things that are outside our controls, like the geopolitics, and the need to ensure that whatever happens in that space in the world, South Africa retains all of the export markets that we're functioning in. Because at the moment, we export about half of what we produce in value and in volume terms. And we want to ensure that we continuously access those markets. So these are the broad issues that I would say all of the respondents in the surveys were raising. And of course, the issue around elections is something that we had picked up also within the data.
Yeah, I'd like us to expand on that elections point a little later on, but perhaps let's touch on what you spoke of, the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic. What has exacerbated the situation from the time? What are the big differences?
I think the other important thing, just to help also the viewers to appreciate about why are we discussing the issue of sentiment in farming, why the confidence index exists. And I think that confidence index helps us to get a sense of where fixed investments in agriculture could go. If you see it depressed for a prolonged period, that means then fixed investments into the sector may be constrained, which is why the last quarter of 2023, confidence index dropped below 50 to 40, and in the first quarter of this year, it remains at those levels. If we continue with the confidence depressed at these levels, then we begin to ask ourselves to say, is there money that people are putting into agriculture for long-term projects? And we know that all of that investments that can come for long-term projects, it's very important when we are thinking about jobs in the sector as well as the growth. And the other aspect at which the viewers can view this index on is that it also tells us something about where the growth potential of the sector could be, because this is almost like a lead indicator of how the sector could perform. And I think it is why it's very important. And of course, then the significance of it dropping to levels that we last saw in the first quarter, which is on COVID. Yes, agriculture grew significantly at that time, but if you look at the underpinning issues at the moment is that, of course, these structural logistical matters, the animal disease issues, and of course, the drought that is there. And I think we can learn something from that because it begins to tell us that while the crop estimates remain tentative, but the sentiment that the farmers and the respondents to the survey are telling us is that perhaps maybe there are regions where this drought is quite deep, to the extent that the economic pain of it in their operations seems comparable to some of the fears that they had at that period when we were in COVID. I think that's the important contextual way of viewing this index.
With the new challenges on the weather front, including, of course, the ongoing El Nino-induced drought that's having a devastating impact on the summer grains, you touched a little bit on elections and, that brings the question of what policymakers should be prioritizing. I mean, looking at the narrative around elections, where is agriculture? Will it get lost in between all of that as we focus our attention on elections?
The aspect of agriculture in election, I mean, we know that in South Africa, whenever we are coming closer to elections, the point about land as well as agriculture typically comes into conversation. But I think if you are a farmer sitting anywhere in the country, what you are listening for from the political leaders is whether do they speak about ways of improving the governance in the municipalities, because at the end of the day, whatever you produce, you deal to a certain extent with the municipalities. If there aren't many messages that are talking about improving the efficiency, that's already an issue for those that are in agriculture. The second aspect is around of saying, are there political parties in their manifestos speaking to issues around logistics? Because the dilemma that we sit with is that roughly 80% of South African agricultural produce is transported by road. So you want to hear these manifestos talking about what they will do to improve the roads. The other aspect that you want to hear them talking about is to say, at the ports, what are some of the plans in addition to what our colleagues at Transnet are already doing to improve the ports? What are some of the plans to increase those? Because ultimately, if South Africa's agriculture already exports half of what it produces, in future, as we plan to expand the agricultural produce, we will want to access as many markets as we can, and the ports are a pipeline of actually ensuring that we access those markets. The geopolitical aspect is something that the farmers, particularly over the past few years, are starting to pay a lot of attention on, because it does, of course, then affect those markets that we are in. And I think the other important aspect is around the land. We understand and know from our data that the South African government, under what is called the PLUS, the Proactive Land Acquisition Strategy, has managed to amass about 2.5 million hectares of land.
Yeah.
Now, the farmers, particularly black farmers, are looking to hear what will government do to release that land with title deeds, because then that means hope for them and expansion in planting. And of course, the entire sector sees that as land of growing the South African agricultural pie. Those are the messages that I think our colleagues in farming are listening for when they read these manifestos from many political parties.
What does this now mean for the end user, the consumer, who, of course, will suffer the most because of the value chain and its impact on the end product?
There's one thing that I want to stress here, to say, while we are talking about an environment that's seemingly bleak, these are challenges for the near term in South Africa's agriculture. This is a sector that still has a potential for growth, potential for creating employment, to an extent that our numbers suggest that this sector could still grow by anywhere between 15 to 30% when you look at the expansion of the gross value added of it, which means then a lot more could still be done here. And of course, there are many preconditions to attain that growth. So the long-term investment in the growth of the sector is something we should all be positive about. For the consumer in the near term, we also need to appreciate that this drought is not affecting all of the agricultural activities equally. Where we will see most impact is on the grain-related products, particularly white maize. On a maize meal, that's where you will see massive impact. But on vegetables, fruit, and meat, we can expect those prices to move sideways, because there's a lot of fruit, there's a lot of vegetables, and our fruit and vegetables are under irrigation. And the poultry industry and the livestock industry are also recovering somewhat from the animal diseases of last year. So we expect prices to move moderately there. And lastly, in the world, when it comes to wheat, it comes to rice, the prices are moderating there, and South Africa imports half of its annual wheat consumption and all of its rice consumption. And if the rand to the dollar remain at fair levels that we are seeing today, then we can expect that it will depend on what the consumer really put in their basket. Because if you buy, for example, now a bag of potatoes, you may find that it is around 50 rand at 10 kg bags of potatoes. You think back in October last year, you might have bought that 10 kgs of a bag of potatoes by over 100 rand. That speaks then to that moderation in vegetables. But on a white maize product, we've seen those prices increasing. So it will depend what the consumer puts on their basket going forward. But for the long term, this is a sector that is growing and very important for our economy.